Montana Territory, 1875. The Montana sunset painted the horizon with strokes of fiery gold and crimson, indifferent to the tragedy unfolding beneath its beauty. Clara Garner stood at the window of her small cabin, 22 years old and already a widow with two young children. The dying light caught in her long ash-blonde hair, which fell in loose waves past her shoulders, a stark contrast to the simple, worn blue calico dress that had faded from too many washings. "Mama, I am hungry," 5-year-old Emma said, tugging at her skirt. Her son Thomas, barely 3, sat quietly by the fireplace, his solemn eyes too old for his young face. "Supper will be ready soon, sweetheart," Clara promised, though the reality of their situation formed a hard knot in her stomach. The pantry held little more than some beans, a bit of cornmeal, and a few potatoes, hardly enough to stretch through the coming week. Winter in Montana was unforgiving, and spring had only just begun to hint at its arrival. 8 months had passed since influenza had taken her husband Michael. 8 months of struggling alone on their small homestead, trying to maintain what they had built together, refusing to acknowledge what had become increasingly clear. She was failing. Clara had a fierce pride that wouldn't let her seek charity, a stubborn belief that hard work alone could overcome any obstacle. It was her core conviction, born of watching her father lose everything back east because he'd trusted the wrong people. She had learned young that depending on others was a weakness she couldn't afford. The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke through her thoughts. Visitors were rare this far from town, especially with mud season making the roads nearly impassable. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and stepped onto the porch, instinctively positioning herself between the approaching rider and the door where her children remained. The horse appeared first, a magnificent chestnut stallion stumbling slightly as it made its way toward the cabin. Its rider was slumped forward in the saddle, one hand clutching the pommel while the other pressed against his side. Even from a distance, Clara could see the dark stain spreading across his shirt. The horse halted in the yard as if sensing it had reached safety. The rider raised his head, revealing a young man's face contorted with pain. His eyes, a startling blue against his sun-bronzed skin, met Clara's for the briefest moment before he pitched sideways from the saddle, landing with a dull thud on the hard-packed earth. For a heartbeat, Clara stood frozen. Helping a stranger meant inviting trouble, using precious resources she couldn't spare. Every instinct warned her to close the door, to protect her children and herself from whatever violence had brought this man to her doorstep. Instead, she found herself running toward him. "Emma, stay inside with your brother," she called over her shoulder, reaching the fallen man in a few quick strides. He was young, perhaps 24 or 25, with a strong jawline softened by light stubble. His clothes were of good quality, not a cowhand's rough attire but a gentleman's riding clothes, though now they were caked with dust and blood. A gun belt with an ornate silver buckle encircled his narrow waist, the revolver still holstered. Clara knelt beside him, gently turning him onto his back. He groaned, eyelids fluttering. "Can you hear me?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear clutching at her throat. "Shot," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Ambush." Her fingers found the wound in his side, the fabric around it soaked with blood. The bullet had entered just below his ribs on the right side. Clara had seen enough wounds during the war, when she'd helped nurse the injured in her Pennsylvania hometown, to know this man needed immediate help. "I need to get you inside," she said, though how she would manage to move him she wasn't sure. As if in answer to her unspoken question, he struggled to sit up, his face paling with the effort. "Help me," he gasped, and Clara slipped her shoulder under his arm, bracing herself against his weight as he staggered to his feet. Together they made their slow way to the cabin, each step punctuated by his labored breathing. Emma's eyes widened as they crossed the threshold, but she remained silent, clutching her brother's hand. "Emma, fetch clean rags from the chest," Clara directed, helping the stranger to the narrow bed in the corner, her own bed, the only one in the single-room cabin aside from the children's small pallets. The young man collapsed onto the mattress with a groan, his eyes closing as Clara quickly assessed what needed to be done. She had to remove the bullet, clean the wound, and stop the bleeding, all with limited supplies and 2 frightened children watching. "Sir," she said, touching his shoulder, "Sir, I need to remove your shirt and tend to that wound." His eyes opened, fever already beginning to glaze them. "Colton," he mumbled, "Colton Jameson." "Mr. Jameson, I am Clara Garner. I am going to help you, but it is going to hurt." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Already hurts, ma'am." Clara worked quickly, cutting away his blood-soaked shirt to reveal the wound. The bullet had lodged just beneath the skin, a small mercy. She sent Emma to heat water while she gathered her few medical supplies, a sewing needle, some strong thread, a bottle of whiskey her husband had kept for medicinal purposes, and a small knife she sterilized in the flame of a candle. "Emma, take Thomas outside," Clara instructed when everything was prepared. "But Mama." Now Emma, Clara rarely used that tone, and Emma knew better than to argue. She took her brother's hand and led him onto the porch, closing the door behind them. Clara turned back to Colton, who watched her through half-lidded eyes. "I need to remove the bullet," she explained, uncorking the whiskey bottle. "Drink some of this first." He took a long swallow, grimacing as the liquor burned down his throat. "Not how I imagined sharing a drink with a beautiful woman," he said, his attempt at humor undermined by the pain in his voice. Clara ignored the comment, pouring some of the whiskey over her hands and the knife. "Ready?" she asked, though it was hardly a question. Ready or not, the bullet had to come out. Colton nodded, gripping the edges of the mattress. Clara worked as quickly and carefully as she could, but extracting the bullet was a messy, painful process. To his credit, Colton remained conscious throughout, his jaw clenched so tightly she feared his teeth might crack. When at last the small lead ball dropped into the basin beside the bed, Clara released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Worst part's over," she assured him, though the wound still needed to be cleaned and stitched. By the time she tied off the final stitch, Colton had passed out, his face ashen beneath his tan. Clara wiped the sweat from his brow with a cool cloth, studying him more carefully now that the immediate crisis had passed. He was undeniably handsome, with high cheekbones and a strong, straight nose. His hair, a rich brown that would lighten in the sun, curled slightly where it fell across his forehead. More telling than his appearance, however, were the calluses on his hands, evidence of hard work despite his fine clothes, and the old scars visible on his chest and arms. This was a man accustomed to the frontier's dangers. Clara covered him with a blanket and opened the door to retrieve her children, who had been waiting patiently on the porch. "Is the man going to die, Mama?" Emma asked as they re-entered the cabin. Clara glanced at Colton's still form. His breathing was shallow but steady. "Not if I can help it," she answered. The next 3 days passed in a haze of exhaustion as Clara tended to the wounded stranger while trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy for her children. Colton's fever rose and fell like the tide, sometimes leaving him lucid enough to take sips of water or broth, other times plunging him into delirious ramblings about cattle rustlers, a place called Willow Creek Ranch, and someone named Sullivan who had apparently betrayed him. On the fourth morning, Clara woke before dawn as usual, stirring the banked coals in the fireplace to life. She moved quietly, not wanting to wake the children who were still curled up on their pallets, or the stranger who had finally fallen into what seemed like restful sleep rather than fever-induced unconsciousness. She was at the wash basin, splashing cold water on her face when a voice startled her. "You saved my life." Clara turned to find Colton Jameson awake, his blue eyes clear and focused on her face. The fever had broken. "You are not out of danger yet, Mr. Jameson," she cautioned, approaching the bed to check his wound. "That bullet came close to your liver." "Colton," he corrected, wincing slightly as she removed the bandage to examine the stitches. "And I know when I am lucky to be alive, Mrs. Garner." "Clara," she offered, relieved to see no signs of infection in the wound. "And it is Miss Garner now. I am a widow." Something flickered in his eyes, understanding perhaps or shared grief. "I am sorry for your loss." Clara replaced the bandage, uncomfortable with his scrutiny and the unexpected gentleness in his voice. "You should rest. Your body has been through a significant trauma." "I have imposed on your kindness long enough," he said, attempting to sit up before a sharp pain forced him back down. "Or at least I would leave if my body would cooperate." Despite herself, Clara smiled. "I believe you will be my guest a while longer, Mr. Jameson." "Colton," he insisted again. "Colton," she conceded, turning away to stoke the fire. "Are you hungry? I can make some porridge." Before he could answer, Emma stirred on her pallet, sitting up and rubbing her eyes. When she saw that Colton was awake, her usual shyness vanished. "You are not going to die," she announced with a child's blunt delight. A genuine smile transformed Colton's face, erasing the lines of pain and revealing a dimple in his right cheek. "Thanks to your mother, it appears I am not." "I helped too," Emma declared, scrambling to her feet. "I fetched the rags and the water and stayed quiet when Mama told me to." "Then I owe you my thanks as well, miss." He trailed off, looking at the little girl expectantly. "Emma," she supplied, "and that is Thomas, but he does not talk much." She pointed to her brother, who was now sitting up, watching the exchange with solemn eyes. Colton's gaze softened as it moved to the boy. "Hello, Thomas." To Clara's surprise, Thomas gave a small wave in return. Over the next week, as Colton gradually regained his strength, Clara learned more about him. He owned a substantial cattle ranch near Willow Creek, about 50 miles to the west. He had been on his way back from Helena, where he'd gone to sign contracts with buyers for his spring cattle drive, when 3 men ambushed him. They took my saddlebags with the contracts and the money I'd brought to pay my ranch hands, he explained one evening as they sat by the fire, the children already asleep. But I think they meant to kill me. Clara's hands stilled in her mending. Why would they want that? Colton's expression darkened. There's a man named Victor Sullivan who's been buying up land all through this part of the territory. He's offered to buy my ranch 3 times, and each time I've refused. When a man like Sullivan can't get what he wants through legal means, he has other ways. You believe this Sullivan hired men to kill you? Clara asked, unable to keep the skepticism from her voice. Such things happened in the dime novels Emma sometimes begged her to read aloud, but surely not in reality. I can't prove it, Colton admitted. But yes, I do, he shifted, grimacing slightly at the pull of his healing wound. The problem is, without those contracts, I stand to lose everything. The buyers will find other suppliers if I can't deliver the cattle on time, and without that income, I can't pay my hands or my bank notes. Clara considered this. How long until you need to be back? The drive is scheduled to start in 3 weeks. Even if I left tomorrow, I'd barely have time to arrange everything. He looked at her directly. But I can't ride yet, can I? Clara assessed him honestly. The wound was healing well, but a long ride would likely tear his stitches and start the bleeding again. Not for at least another week, probably 2 to be safe. Frustration flashed across his face, quickly replaced by resignation. Then I suppose Victor Sullivan may get his wish after all, just not the way he planned. Clara returned to her mending, troubled by his words. She had her own problems, the dwindling food stores, the spring planting she couldn't manage alone, the leaking roof she had no means to repair. And yet she couldn't ignore the unfairness of his situation. What if someone rode to your ranch with a message, she suggested. Surely your foreman could begin preparations while you recover. Hope sparked in Colton's eyes. That might work, but he glanced around the small cabin, understanding dawning. You're alone here, aren't you? No neighbors close by who could make the journey. Clara nodded reluctantly. The nearest farm is 15 miles east. I haven't seen Mr. Peterson since before the first snow. Colton fell silent, and Clara could almost see him calculating distances and possibilities. Finally, he sighed. It's too much to ask. You've already done more than enough, taking in a stranger, tending my wounds. I couldn't very well leave you to die on my doorstep, Clara pointed out, trying to lighten the moment. His expression remained serious. Many would have. The frontier isn't kind to the soft-hearted. Clara bristled at that. I am not soft-hearted, Mr. Jameson, I am practical. And right now, practicality suggests we both need help, you with your ranch and I with this homestead. Interest sharpened his gaze. What are you proposing? When you're well enough to travel, we'll go to your ranch together. You'll have the help you need for your cattle drive, and perhaps I can find work in town or on your ranch to earn enough to hire help for my spring planting. The idea formed as she spoke, gaining clarity and purpose. The children and I can't stay here much longer anyway. We're nearly out of provisions. Colton studied her, surprise and something like admiration in his expression. You'd pack up your children and travel with a man you barely know. I know you're not the type to repay kindness with cruelty, Clara said firmly. And sometimes survival requires taking risks. A slow smile spread across his face. Clara Garner, I believe you may have just saved my life a second time. The following days took on a new urgency as they prepared for the journey. Clara mended Colton's blood-stained shirt as best she could and helped him exercise his injured side, walking short distances each day to build his strength. Meanwhile, she packed their few belongings and preserved what little food remained for the trip. Emma was ecstatic about the adventure, while Thomas remained watchful and quiet. Clara worried about uprooting them, even temporarily, but she knew staying meant certain hardship, if not starvation. Colton spent hours with the children, whittling tiny animals for Thomas and telling Emma stories about his ranch, the horses, the cattle, the wide-open spaces where wildflowers bloomed in spring. Clara often paused in her work to watch them, struck by how naturally he interacted with her children and how readily they had accepted him into their small family circle. It was during one such moment, as Colton demonstrated to Emma how to tie a special knot cowboys used, that Clara felt an unexpected warmth bloom in her chest. She quickly tamped it down. Developing feelings for this man would be foolish. Once he returned to his ranch and his life, he would have no place in his world for a widow and her two young children. Their arrangement was one of mutual convenience, nothing more. 10 days after Colton's arrival, they departed at dawn. Clara's few valuables and clothes were packed in a single trunk, strapped behind the saddle on Colton's horse. Emma rode in front of Colton, while Clara walked alongside, carrying Thomas. They would take turns, Colton had insisted, though Clara suspected his still-healing wound would prevent him from walking far. The journey to Willow Creek would take 5 days at their necessarily slow pace. As they left the small cabin behind, Clara felt a pang of loss. Despite its shortcomings, it had been her home, the place where her children were born, where she had been happy with Michael. But she straightened her shoulders and faced forward. She had never been one to dwell on the past when the future demanded her attention. The first day's travel was harder than Clara had anticipated. The spring sun beat down on them as they followed the rutted trail westward, and by midday Thomas had become fussy and Emma's excitement had waned. Colton, she noticed, was paler than usual, though he made no complaint. "We should rest," Clara suggested when they reached a small creek around noon. "The children need to eat, and you need to save your strength." Colton didn't argue, carefully dismounting and helping Emma down before leaning against a tree, one hand pressed against his side. "I'll be fine," he assured Clara when he caught her concerned glance. "Just need a moment." They ate a simple meal of cornbread and jerky, the children splashing in the shallow water afterward while Clara checked Colton's wound. It was healing well with no signs of infection, but the day's exertion had clearly strained it. "We'll make camp early tonight," she decided. "There's no sense in pushing so hard that you tear your stitches." "We need to cover as much ground as possible," Colton countered, though without much conviction. Clara fixed him with a stern look. "We need you alive and well when we reach your ranch, not bleeding out on the trail." He held her gaze for a moment, then nodded, a reluctant smile tugging at his lips. "Yes, ma'am." They made camp a few hours later in a sheltered grove of pines. While Colton built a small fire, Clara prepared a simple stew with the last of their potatoes and some wild onions she had gathered along the way. The children, exhausted from the day's journey, fell asleep almost immediately after eating, curled together under a blanket near the fire. Clara and Colton sat in companionable silence as night descended, the fire casting flickering shadows on their faces. Stars emerged overhead, countless diamonds scattered across the velvet darkness. "You never told me how you ended up alone on that homestead," Colton said quietly, breaking the silence. Clara stared into the flames. "My husband Michael and I came west 3 years ago. He had dreams of building a cattle operation like yours someday. We started small, with just a few acres and a handful of cattle." She smiled faintly at the memory. "He was so certain we would succeed." "What happened?" Colton prompted gently when she fell silent. "Influenza," Clara replied, the word still bitter on her tongue. "It swept through the area last summer. Michael was so strong I never imagined," she trailed off, swallowing hard. "It took him in just 3 days. After the funeral, most of our neighbors offered to buy our land, assuming I would return east to my family. But I couldn't bear to give up what we had worked so hard to build." "So you stayed and tried to run the homestead alone," Colton concluded, admiration evident in his voice. Clara nodded. "I thought determination would be enough." "I was wrong." "Not wrong," Colton corrected, "just facing impossible odds. No one can run a frontier homestead alone, especially not with young children to care for." "Is that why you never married?" Clara asked, then immediately regretted the personal question. "I am sorry, that was presumptuous." But Colton didn't seem offended. "No need to apologize, and to answer your question, I always believed the frontier was no place for family life. Too harsh, too unpredictable." He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks dancing upward. "My father was a rancher in Texas. He built something substantial, only to lose it all and his life in a range war when I was 16. My mother never recovered from the grief. She died a year later." "I am so sorry," Clara said, understanding now the shadows she sometimes glimpsed in his eyes. Colton shrugged, though the casual gesture couldn't disguise the old pain. "It taught me a valuable lesson. Attachment is a vulnerability out here. Better to focus on building something lasting than risk losing everything because you care too much about someone." Clara studied his profile in the firelight. "That sounds like a lonely way to live." Maybe, he acknowledged, but it's safer. Clara thought of Michael, of the brief years they'd had together, the joy and the heartbreak. I would rather have loved and lost than never loved at all, she said softly. Colton looked at her then, really looked at her as if seeing something new. Would you? Even knowing how it would end. Yes, Clara answered without hesitation. Every moment was worth the pain that followed. A log shifted in the fire, sending up a shower of sparks. In their light, Clara thought she saw something shift in Colton's expression as well, a softening, a question forming, but then he looked away, back to the flames. We should get some rest, he said. Tomorrow will be another long day. As Clara settled beside her children, pulling a blanket around them all, she wondered if she had imagined that moment of connection, and if she hadn't, what it might mean for both of them. The next 4 days fell into a rhythm as they made their way west, alternating between riding and walking, making camp each night beneath the vast Montana sky. Colton grew stronger each day, and by the time they crested a hill on the 5th afternoon, he was able to ride for hours without discomfort. There it is, he said, pointing to the valley below, Willow Creek Ranch. Clara followed his gesture and caught her breath. The ranch spread out before them, far larger than she had imagined. A substantial 2-story house of weathered wood and stone stood near a creek lined with the willows that gave the place its name. Several smaller buildings, a bunkhouse, barns, and outbuildings, formed a rough half-circle around a central yard. Beyond, fenced pastures stretched toward distant hills dotted with cattle. It's beautiful, Emma breathed, echoing Clara's unspoken thought. Colton's face lit with pride. I built most of it myself with help from my hands. Started with just the land and a dream like your father. He glanced at Clara. It's home. As they descended toward the ranch, a rider spotted them and galloped in their direction. He was a weathered man in his 40s, his face breaking into a wide grin as he recognized Colton. Boss, he called, reining in his horse. We thought you were dead. Not quite, Frank, Colton replied with a smile. Though it was a near thing, this is Clara Garner and her children Emma and Thomas. They saved my life. Frank tipped his hat to Clara. Then we're mighty indebted to you, ma'am. He turned back to Colton, his expression growing serious. We've got trouble, boss. Sullivan's been telling everyone you're dead, and his men have been spotted near our north boundary. Word is he's planning to claim your lands abandoned if you don't show up for the bank payment next week. Colton's jaw tightened. And the cattle drive. We've been preparing as best we can without contracts, but the men are getting nervous. 3 quit last week to work for Sullivan. Clara saw the muscle in Colton's jaw twitch. We'll sort it out, he said firmly. First, let's get Mrs. Garner and her children settled. The homecoming was both joyous and tense as they rode into the ranch yard. The remaining hands gathered around, relief evident on their faces as they welcomed Colton back. Clara felt overwhelmed by the attention, acutely aware of her travel-stained dress and dusty appearance as she was introduced to what seemed like a dozen men in quick succession. Martha will show you to your rooms, Colton told Clara, indicating a plump, gray-haired woman who had emerged from the main house. She's our cook and housekeeper and the closest thing to civilization in these parts. Martha approached with a warm smile, immediately taking charge of the children with grandmotherly efficiency. You poor dears must be exhausted. Come along, I've got hot water for baths and fresh bread just out of the oven. Clara hesitated, glancing at Colton, suddenly uncertain of her place here. He seemed to understand her discomfort. Get settled, he said quietly. We'll talk later about arrangements. As Clara followed Martha into the house, she couldn't help but be impressed by its interior. The furnishings were simple but well-made, the rooms spacious and thoughtfully arranged. It spoke of prosperity without ostentation, of a man who valued comfort over show. Martha led them to adjoining rooms on the 2nd floor, a larger one for Clara and a smaller one for the children, connected by a door. Both had large windows overlooking the creek and mountains beyond, comfortable beds with clean linens and solid wooden furniture. These are lovely, Clara said, genuinely appreciative but also increasingly aware of the gulf between her circumstances and Colton's. This was no struggling homestead but a successful operation, run by a man who clearly commanded respect from his employees. What had she been thinking, bringing her children here, imposing on his hospitality? Mr. Jameson said you saved his life, Martha commented as she poured steaming water into a hip bath. He's a good man, our boss, not one to forget a debt. I did what anyone would have done, Clara demurred, helping Emma out of her dusty clothes. Martha snorted. Plenty wouldn't have, especially a woman alone with little ones to think about. She straightened, studying Clara with kind but shrewd eyes. Well, you're welcome here for as long as you need. God knows this place could use a woman's touch and some children's laughter. After baths and a hearty meal in the kitchen, the children fell asleep almost immediately in their new beds. Clara, however, found herself restless, drawn to the window by the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch settling for the night. The moon had risen, casting silver light over the buildings and pastures, and in its glow she could make out a solitary figure standing by the corral, Colton, his stance suggesting deep thought or concern. Before she could reconsider, Clara slipped downstairs and out into the cool night air. She approached quietly, not wanting to intrude on his solitude, but he turned at the sound of her footsteps. Clara, he greeted her, surprise and something warmer in his voice. You should be resting after our journey. As should you, she countered, coming to stand beside him at the fence. Your wound still needs time to heal completely. He smiled slightly, always the nurse. They stood in silence for a moment, the night sounds enveloping them, crickets, the occasional snort from a horse in the corral, the distant lowing of cattle. Frank says Sullivan's been busy while I've been gone, Colton finally said. He's convinced the bank to move up my payment date, knowing I wouldn't be here to make it. Without the money from those contracts, you could lose everything, Clara finished for him. Colton nodded, his profile grim in the moonlight. I've worked too hard to let that happen. I'll find a way, even if it means selling off half my stock at a loss. Clara hesitated, then spoke the thought that had been forming since dinner. I should take the children to town tomorrow, find work, perhaps as a seamstress or cook. We've imposed on your hospitality long enough, especially with these troubles. Colton turned to her, frowning. You're not imposing. You saved my life, Clara. The least I can do is offer you shelter while you decide your next steps. But your focus should be on saving your ranch, not concerning yourself with us. He studied her face in the moonlight. Has it occurred to you that I might need help? Martha can't manage the house alone anymore, and with 3 hands gone, we're short-handed for the drive. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I'm proposing a fair exchange, work for room and board for as long as you wish to stay. Clara considered his offer. It would solve her immediate problem of shelter and food for her children, give her time to plan their future more carefully. And despite her initial misgivings, she felt safe here, welcomed. I accept, she said, but I insist on earning my keep. I can cook, clean, sew, and I'm not afraid of hard work. Colton's smile returned, more genuine this time. I never thought you were. He extended his hand as if to seal their agreement, and Clara took it. His palm was warm and calloused against hers, his grip firm but gentle. Welcome to Willow Creek Ranch, Clara Garner, he said softly. Something shifted between them in that moment, some understanding that went beyond their practical arrangement. Clara felt it like a current passing between their joined hands, saw it reflected in the sudden intensity of Colton's gaze. She withdrew her hand first, unnerved by her own response. Good night, Mr. Jameson, she said, taking a step back. Colton, he reminded her, amusement now tempering the heat in his eyes. Colton, she conceded, turning to walk back to the house before he could see the flush she felt rising in her cheeks. In the days that followed, Clara settled into life at Willow Creek Ranch with surprising ease. Martha welcomed her help in the kitchen and showed her the running of the household, while Emma and Thomas quickly became favorites among the ranch hands, who slipped them candy and taught them to whistle when they thought Clara wasn't watching. Colton was often absent, riding out at dawn to oversee preparations for the cattle drive or meeting with neighboring ranchers to seek loans. When their paths did cross, at meals or in the evenings when he would sometimes read to the children before bedtime, Clara found herself increasingly drawn to him, impressed by his integrity, his commitment to his land and his men, and the gentle way he interacted with her children. A week after their arrival, Colton returned from town looking grim. Clara was in the kitchen, kneading bread dough while Martha showed Emma how to shape biscuits. He hesitated in the doorway, clearly reluctant to speak in front of the child. Emma, why don't you take these scraps out to the chickens? Martha suggested, giving the girl a small bowl of dough trimmings. Once Emma had skipped outside, Colton entered the kitchen. Sullivan's made his move, he said without preamble. He's convinced the bank to call in my loan early, all of it, not just the regular payment. I have 3 days to come up with the full amount. Clara wiped her hands on her apron. Can you raise the money? Not in 3 days, Colton admitted. I've tried every angle. The spring drive would have covered it, but without the contracts. He broke off, frustration evident in every line of his body. What will happen? Clara asked quietly. Sullivan will buy the note from the bank and foreclose. He'll have this place by the end of the week. Colton's voice was flat, resigned in a way she had never heard before. Martha made a distressed sound. There must be something we can do. Colton shook his head. I've thought of everything. Unless money falls from the sky in the next 3 days, Willow Creek will belong to Victor Sullivan. Clara watched him, this proud man facing the loss of everything he had built, and felt a surge of determination. We're not giving up, she said firmly. There must be a way. Colton looked at her, surprised by her vehemence. I appreciate the sentiment, Clara, but… No, she interrupted. You took us in when we had nowhere to go. This is our home now too, and we'll fight for it. Something kindled in Colton's eyes, not quite hope, but a spark that hadn't been there before. Our home, he repeated softly, as if testing the words. Clara flushed, realizing how presumptuous she had sounded. I know what you meant, Colton said, and now there was definitely a warmth in his gaze that made her heart beat faster. And I'm grateful for it. That evening after the children were asleep, Clara found Colton in his study, surrounded by papers, ledgers, banknotes, contracts. He looked up when she entered, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration she had come to recognize. May I? She asked, indicating the chair across from his desk. He nodded, setting aside the papers. I'm not very good company right now. I don't need company, Clara replied. I need information. If we're going to save this ranch, I need to understand exactly what we're facing. Colton raised an eyebrow at her determination, but began explaining the situation. The bank had called in his loan of $5,000 due in full in 3 days. Without the contracts for the cattle drive, he had less than $1,000 in ready cash. His neighbors, many of whom were in similar financial straits, couldn't help. Selling cattle quickly would mean accepting pennies on the dollar, not nearly enough to cover the debt. What about the contracts themselves? Clara asked. You said the men who ambushed you took them. Along with the cash I was carrying, Colton confirmed. Even if we could prove Sullivan was behind the ambush, the contracts are gone. Without them, the buyers in Chicago won't honor our agreement. Clara thought for a moment, but if you had copies of the contracts… Colton shook his head. I don't, they were drawn up in Helena, signed there. The buyers must have copies, Clara pointed out, in Chicago 1,000 miles away. What about the lawyer who drew them up? Colton stared at her, realization dawning. James Wilson, he would have kept copies in his files. Is Helena too far to reach in time? Clara asked. Hope flared briefly in Colton's eyes, then dimmed. It's a 3-day ride each way, and that's pushing hard. Even if I left now, I wouldn't make it back before the deadline. Clara considered this. What if you telegraph him, ask him to send copies by courier? That might work, Colton said slowly, except that Sullivan will be watching the telegraph office. Any message to Wilson would alert him to what we're planning. They sat in frustrated silence, so close to a solution yet still blocked. Then Clara had another thought. What if someone else went to Helena? Someone Sullivan wouldn't suspect. Colton looked at her sharply. You. Clara nodded. I could take the morning stage. A woman traveling alone wouldn't attract attention, especially if I said I was visiting family. It's too dangerous, Colton objected immediately. The road to Helena has its share of outlaws, and you don't know the city. I grew up in Philadelphia, Clara reminded him. I think I can manage Helena, and the stage is well guarded. Colton shook his head, his expression troubled. I can't ask you to take that risk. You're not asking, I'm offering, Clara said simply. Besides, what alternative do we have? Colton studied her for a long moment, conflict evident in his face. Finally, he sighed. If you're determined to do this, at least let me send Frank with you. That would defeat the purpose, Clara pointed out. Sullivan knows your men, he'd suspect something immediately. Clara, my children will be safe here with Martha, she continued, and I'll be back in 3 days, well before the bank deadline. Colton stood and paced to the window, his back to her. When he turned, his expression was resolved but still concerned. If you're going to do this, you'll need money for the stage fare and hotel and a letter of introduction to Wilson. Clara felt a surge of triumph. You'll let me go, then? I don't seem to have much choice, Colton admitted ruefully. You're as stubborn as you are brave, Clara Garner. The next morning dawned clear and crisp as Clara prepared to leave for Helena. She had explained to the children that she needed to take care of some business and would return in a few days. Emma had accepted this with a child's resilience, especially when Colton promised to teach her to ride while Clara was gone. Thomas had been more difficult, clinging to her skirts with unusual vehemence until she promised to bring him a special gift from the city. Now, as she stood by the waiting stage, Clara found herself similarly reluctant to leave. Not because of fear for the journey, but because of the growing sense that Willow Creek Ranch had become more than a temporary shelter. It had begun to feel like home. Colton stood beside her, his face serious as he handed her an envelope. "The letter for Wilson, stage fare and money for your stay," he explained. "The Montana hotel is respectable and safe for a woman traveling alone." Clara tucked the envelope into her reticule. "I know what to do." "I know you do," he said softly. Then, surprising her, he took her hand. "Clara, he hesitated, seeming to struggle for words. "Thank you for doing this. For caring about Willow Creek." She looked up at him, struck by the emotion in his blue eyes. "It's not just the ranch," she admitted. "It's the people who call it home." Something shifted in his gaze, a realization or decision forming. But before he could speak again, the stage driver called for passengers to board. "I should go," Clara said, reluctantly withdrawing her hand. Colton nodded, helping her into the coach. As she settled on the seat, he leaned in, his voice low. "Be careful, and Clara, come back to us." The stage lurched forward before she could respond, but his words warmed her throughout the long, dusty journey to Helena. "Come back to us." Not come back safely or return quickly, but come back to us, to the ranch, to the children, to him. Helena was larger and more bustling than Clara had expected, a proper city growing amidst the mountains, with brick buildings lining the main street and well-dressed people hurrying about their business. After securing a room at the Montana Hotel, she made her way to the offices of Wilson and Associates, Legal Services. James Wilson proved to be a balding man in his 50s with shrewd eyes and a cautious manner. He read Colton's letter twice before acknowledging Clara. "Mrs. Garner, this is highly irregular," he said finally. "These contracts contain sensitive financial information. I can't simply hand copies to anyone who walks in, even with Mr. Jameson's written request." Clara had anticipated this difficulty. "I understand your concern, Mr. Wilson, but surely you're aware of the situation with Victor Sullivan and the bank." Wilson's expression tightened. "I've heard rumors. Sullivan has been aggressive in his acquisitions lately." "Then you know what's at stake," Clara pressed. "Without those contracts, Colton will lose everything he's built." Wilson removed his spectacles, polishing them thoughtfully. "I drafted those contracts myself, Mrs. Garner. They're solid and legally binding. If the buyers in Chicago have seen no copies from Mr. Jameson, they might assume he's backed out of the deal." "Which is exactly what Sullivan wants them to think," Clara said. "We need to prove the contracts exist and that Colton intends to honor them." Wilson sighed, replacing his spectacles. "I sympathize with Mr. Jameson's situation, truly I do. But I have professional obligations to consider." Clara felt desperation rising. She had come too far to fail now. "Mr. Wilson, I am not asking you to compromise your principles. I am asking you to help prevent a grave injustice. Colton was ambushed on his way home from signing those contracts, shot and nearly killed. The men who attacked him took the contracts and the money he was carrying." Wilson's eyes widened at this information. "Are you certain it was Sullivan's doing?" "We can't prove it," Clara admitted, "but the timing is too convenient to be coincidence, especially with the bank suddenly calling in Colton's loan." Wilson was silent for a long moment, weighing her words. Finally, he stood and moved to a large filing cabinet in the corner of his office. "I need to send a telegram to confirm your identity and Mr. Jameson's request," he said, his tone making it clear this was non-negotiable. Clara's heart sank. A telegram to Willow Creek would alert Sullivan to their plan. "Mr. Wilson, please." He held up a hand to silence her. "Not to Willow Creek, to Judge Harmon in Bozeman. He and Mr. Jameson served together during the war. If the judge confirms you're acting on Colton's behalf, I'll provide the copies you need." Relief flooded through Clara. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Wilson cautioned. "The telegraph office closes in an hour, and I won't have a response until morning. You'll need to return tomorrow." Clara left Wilson's office with mixed feelings. The delay was frustrating but unavoidable. As she walked back toward her hotel, she found herself studying the shop windows along the main street. suddenly conscious of her plain, worn dress and practical boots. Helena's women were fashionably attired in ways that reminded her of Philadelphia, making her acutely aware of how much her life had changed in the years since she'd left the East. On impulse, she entered a dress shop, using a small portion of the money Colton had given her to purchase a new shirtwaist in a soft blue that complemented her eyes. It was a practical garment, not frivolous, she told herself, something suitable for business in Helena. But as the shopkeeper wrapped her purchase, Clara couldn't deny the flutter of pleasure at the thought of wearing something pretty again, of perhaps seeing appreciation in Colton's eyes when she returned. That evening in her hotel room, Clara penned a letter to Emma and Thomas, telling them about the tall buildings and busy streets of Helena, promising to return soon with the gifts she had promised. As she wrote, she realized how deeply she missed them after just one day apart and how completely they had adjusted to life at Willow Creek. Emma had bloomed in the open spaces of the ranch, while Thomas had begun speaking more, especially to Colton, who treated the boy's solemn questions with the same respect he showed his ranch hands. When sleep finally came, Clara dreamed of wide pastures under Montana skies, of her children laughing as they ran toward a house that somehow combined the best features of her lost homestead and Willow Creek's main house. In the dream, Colton stood on the porch, watching with that warm smile that made his eyes crinkle at the corners. He held out his hand to her, and she was running to join him when the dream dissolved into morning light filtering through the hotel room curtains. The next day brought success. Judge Harmon's telegram confirmed Clara's identity and mission, and Wilson provided the contract copies, along with a personal note to the buyers in Chicago explaining the situation. Clara left his office with the precious documents secured in her reticule, a weight lifting from her shoulders. Now she needed only to return to Willow Creek in time for Colton to use them to secure a loan against the promised cattle sale. The return stage wasn't scheduled to depart until the following morning, leaving Clara with an unexpected day of freedom in Helena. After purchasing small gifts for the children, a carved wooden horse for Thomas and a hair ribbon for Emma, she found herself drawn to a bookshop. Inside, among the shelves of leather-bound volumes, she discovered a section of agricultural texts. One in particular caught her eye: Modern Cattle Ranching, Methods for the Progressive Stockman. Clara thumbed through it, thinking of Colton and his determination to build something lasting. The book was expensive, but before she could reconsider, she had paid for it and had it wrapped alongside the children's gifts. It wasn't until she was back in her hotel room that she wondered what had prompted her to make such a personal purchase for him. A thank you gift, she told herself, nothing more. The stage departed Helena at dawn the next day, carrying Clara and 5 other passengers. The journey was uneventful until mid-afternoon when they were still a good 4 hours from Willow Creek. The driver pulled the team to an abrupt halt, cursing loudly. Clara peered out the window to see what had caused the delay. A large tree trunk blocked the road ahead, clearly felled deliberately across the narrow pass. "Stay inside, folks," the driver called down, "could be road agents." A chill ran through Clara at his words. Highway robbery was common enough in the territory, but the timing and location made her suspect this was no random occurrence. Sullivan, perhaps, had learned of her mission after all. The shotgun messenger climbed down from his perch beside the driver, weapon at the ready. "Show yourselves," he called out to the surrounding trees. Silence answered him, then a shot rang out. The messenger crumpled to the ground, and the driver raised his hands in surrender as 3 mounted men emerged from the trees, bandanas covering the lower halves of their faces. "Out of the coach, all of you," one shouted. "Hands where we can see them." Clara clutched her reticule containing the contracts, heart pounding as she followed the other passengers out of the stage. The robbers dismounted, keeping their guns trained on the group. "Valuables in the bag," the apparent leader ordered, holding out a canvas sack. "Watches, jewelry, wallets now." The passengers complied, dropping their possessions into the sack with trembling hands. When it was Clara's turn, she reluctantly surrendered her small purse containing her remaining money, but kept the reticule pressed against her side, praying the robbers wouldn't notice or would assume it contained only female necessities. Her hope was short-lived. "You too, lady," the leader said, gesturing with his gun toward her reticule. "Everything." "Please," Clara said, thinking quickly. "It contains only personal items, a letter from my late husband, a lock of my child's hair." "Nothing of value to you." The man's eyes narrowed above his bandana. "Let me be the judge of that." He reached for the reticule, and Clara instinctively stepped back. In that moment, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew everyone's attention. The robbers turned, guns raised, as a group of riders appeared around the bend. Clara's heart leaped with recognition and relief. Colton led the group, with Frank and two other Willow Creek hands flanking him. They pulled up short at the sight of the stagecoach and the armed men. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Colton called, his voice deceptively casual though his hand rested near his holstered gun. "Seems we've interrupted something." The leader of the robbers cursed. "This ain't your business, cowboy, ride on if you want to live." Colton's gaze found Clara among the passengers, his expression hardening when he saw the man threatening her. "That's where you're wrong," he said, his tone no longer casual. "You're holding up a stage on Double J range land and threatening people under my protection. That makes it very much my business." The standoff lasted only seconds before the shooting started. Clara dropped to the ground, clutching the reticule to her chest as gunfire erupted around her. One of the robbers fell immediately, shot from his horse by Frank's accurate fire. The leader turned his gun on Colton, but Colton was faster, his bullet finding its mark before the outlaw could pull his trigger. The third robber, seeing his companions fall, made a desperate break for the trees, firing wildly as he fled. One of Colton's men cried out, clutching his arm, but another's shot caught the fleeing man in the back. He tumbled from his horse and lay still. In the sudden silence that followed, Clara heard Colton calling her name. She raised her head to see him dismounting in a fluid motion, crossing the distance between them in long strides. "Clara," he knelt beside her, his hands gentle as they searched for injuries. "Are you hurt?" "No," she managed, still clutching the reticule. "I am fine, how did you know?" "Wilson telegraphed that you'd left Helena with the contracts," Colton explained, helping her to her feet. "When we heard rumors of road agents watching the Helena Road, I feared Sullivan had learned of our plan." Clara glanced at the fallen robbers. "You think Sullivan sent them?" "I'd stake my life on it," Colton said grimly. "Though we'll never prove it now." As Frank and the others secured the scene and tended to the wounded shotgun messenger, Colton led Clara to his horse. "We're less than an hour from the ranch," he said. "Can you ride with me?" "I want to get you back safely." Clara nodded, allowing him to lift her onto his horse before mounting behind her. The solid warmth of his chest against her back was reassuring after the terror of the holdup. She leaned into him slightly, feeling his arm tighten around her waist in response. "I was afraid I'd be too late," he said quietly, his breath warm against her ear as they rode away from the stagecoach. "When I realized Sullivan might know about the contracts." Clara turned slightly to look up at him. "You came for me." His blue eyes met hers, intense and unguarded. "I will always come for you, Clara." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning beyond the immediate situation. Clara felt something shift in her heart, a recognition of what had been growing between them since that first night at her homestead. But before she could respond, Colton looked away, focusing on the trail ahead. "The children?" she asked, remembering her other worry. "Safe at the ranch with Martha," Colton assured her. "They've been counting the hours until your return. Thomas even helped Martha bake cookies for you." Clara smiled at the image. "And the bank, have they extended the deadline?" "No," Colton admitted. "We have until noon tomorrow to pay in full." He nodded toward the reticule she still clutched. "Did you get them?" "The contracts?" Clara patted the leather bag. "All 3 copies with Wilson's authentication. Will it be enough to secure a loan?" "It should be," Colton said. "The First Bank of Helena has a branch in town. If the contracts prove I have guaranteed buyers for the herd, they should extend credit against the future sale." They rode in companionable silence for a while, the rhythm of the horses' hooves matching the steady beat of Clara's heart. She was acutely aware of Colton's nearness, of the strength in the arm that encircled her waist, of the faint scent of leather and pine that she had come to associate with him. "I bought you something in Helena," she said suddenly, surprising herself with the admission. She felt rather than saw his smile. "Did you now? It wasn't necessary." "I wanted to," Clara replied simply. "To thank you for all you've done for me and the children." Colton's arm tightened slightly around her waist. "Having you at Willow Creek has been," he paused, searching for the right words. "It's made the place feel more like a home than just a ranch." The significance of that statement wasn't lost on Clara. For a man who had deliberately avoided attachments, who had built his life around the belief that the frontier was no place for family, it represented a profound shift. "The children love it there," she said carefully. "They've thrived these past weeks." "And you," Colton asked, his voice low, "have you been happy at Willow Creek?" Clara considered the question honestly. Happier than I expected to be again, she admitted. After Michael died, I thought that part of my life was over, that all that remained was surviving for the children's sake. And now, she turned in the saddle again, meeting his gaze directly. Now I find myself hoping for more than just survival. Something kindled in Colton's eyes at her words, a warmth that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. But whatever he might have said in response was lost as they crested a rise and Willow Creek Ranch came into view below them, bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. Home, Colton said simply, and Clara felt the truth of it resonate within her. Emma and Thomas burst from the main house as they rode into the yard, their excited voices carrying across the open space. Colton dismounted first, then lifted Clara down, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary before he released her to greet her children. "Mama," Emma cried, flinging herself into Clara's arms. "Did you bring us presents?" Clara laughed, embracing both children tightly. "Is that all you missed, the presents?" "No," Thomas said seriously. "We missed you lots, but you promised presents." Over their heads, Clara met Colton's amused gaze. "So I did, and I always keep my promises." "Always?" Colton asked softly, a question in his eyes that had nothing to do with gifts from Helena. "Always," Clara confirmed, holding his gaze a moment longer before turning her attention back to her eager children. The evening passed in a blur of activity. After distributing the gifts from Helena, met with squeals of delight from Emma and solemn appreciation from Thomas, Clara handed over the precious contracts to Colton. He spread them on his desk, reading through them carefully while Clara watched, tension building in her shoulders as she waited for his verdict. Finally he looked up, a smile breaking across his face. "These are perfect," he said. "Exactly what we need. With these I can secure a loan tomorrow morning and pay off Sullivan's note before the deadline." Relief washed over Clara, then the ranch is saved. "Thanks to you," Colton confirmed, rising from his desk to approach her. "I don't know how to thank you, Clara." She shook her head. "You don't need to thank me. You've given my children and me a home when we had none. This was the least I could do in return." Colton took her hands in his expression serious. "It was far more than that, and you know it. You risked your life today." Clara looked down at their joined hands. "I couldn't bear the thought of you losing something you've worked so hard to build." "Not when I had the power to prevent it." "Why?" Colton asked softly, and when she looked up, she found his blue eyes studying her intently. The question hung between them, demanding an honesty Clara wasn't sure she was ready to give. But the events of the day, the fear she had felt when the robbers threatened her, the relief at seeing Colton ride to her rescue, the comfort of his arms around her on the journey home, had stripped away her usual caution. "Because I care about you," she admitted, "more than I should perhaps, more than I intended to." Colton's expression softened, hope and uncertainty warring in his gaze. "Clara." A knock at the study door interrupted whatever he had been about to say. Martha's voice called through the wood. "Supper's ready, and those children are about to eat the tablecloth if you don't come soon." Colton released Clara's hands reluctantly. "We'll be right there," he called back, then turned to Clara with a rueful smile. "To be continued." She nodded, her heart lighter than it had been in months, despite the unanswered questions between them. "To be continued." The next morning dawned clear and promising. Colton left for town at first light, the contracts secured in his saddlebags, determination evident in every line of his body. Clara watched him ride out, then turned her attention to the children and the daily routine of the ranch, trying not to count the hours until his return. By mid-morning, an unexpected visitor arrived at Willow Creek. Clara was in the kitchen garden with Emma, showing her how to tell when the carrots were ready to harvest, when the sound of an approaching carriage drew their attention. A sleek black buggy pulled by two matched grays came up the drive, a driver in a dark suit handling the reins. Behind him sat a distinguished-looking man in his 50s, expensively dressed in a tailored suit and silk waistcoat, a gold watch chain gleaming against the fabric. "Who is that?" Emma asked, shading her eyes to see better. Clara shook her head. "I don't know, sweetheart. Stay here while I find out." She wiped her hands on her apron and moved to meet the carriage as it stopped in the yard. The driver jumped down to assist his employer, who descended with the confident air of a man accustomed to deference. "Good morning," Clara greeted them cautiously. "Can I help you?" The man's assessing gaze swept over her, taking in the apron, the simple dress, the garden soil on her hands. I'm looking for Colton Jameson, he said, his voice cultured with an Eastern accent. Is he available? Mr. Jameson is in town on business, Clara replied. He's expected back this afternoon. May I ask who's calling? The man removed his hat, revealing silver-streaked dark hair perfectly groomed. Victor Sullivan, he introduced himself with a slight bow. I have business matters to discuss with Mr. Jameson. Clara stiffened at the name, instantly on guard. This was the man who had tried to steal Colton's ranch, who had possibly ordered the ambush that nearly killed him, who might have sent the road agents to intercept her stage. It took considerable effort to maintain her composure. Mr. Sullivan, she acknowledged with a nod. As I said, Mr. Jameson isn't here. Perhaps you'd like to leave a message. Sullivan studied her with renewed interest. You must be the widow Garner, he said, surprising her with his knowledge of her identity. I've heard about you, the good Samaritan who saved our mutual friend after his unfortunate accident. The deliberate emphasis he placed on the word accident confirmed Clara's suspicions about his involvement. She lifted her chin slightly. News travels fast in the territory. Indeed it does, Sullivan agreed, his smile not reaching his eyes. For instance, I heard just this morning that Mr. Jameson was attempting to secure a loan at the Helena Bank, using certain contracts as collateral, contracts that were reported stolen some weeks ago. Clara's heart sank. If Sullivan knew about Colton's plan, he might have already taken steps to counter it. Mr. Jameson's business affairs are his own concern, Mr. Sullivan. I couldn't comment on them. Sullivan's smile widened, becoming more genuine but no less predatory. Of course not, Mrs. Garner, but perhaps we could speak more comfortably inside. The sun is quite warm. Clara hesitated. Every instinct warned against allowing this man into the house, but refusing might provoke him. Before she could decide, Frank appeared from the direction of the stables, his approach casual but his hand resting near his holstered gun. Everything all right, Mrs. Garner? He asked, his gaze fixed on Sullivan. Clara had never been so glad to see the foreman. Yes, thank you, Frank. Mr. Sullivan was just leaving. He'll call again when Mr. Jameson is here. Sullivan's expression hardened momentarily before smoothing into polite regret. Another time then, he said, replacing his hat. Please tell Jameson I called. The deadline for his loan payment is noon today. I would hate for him to miss it. The threat was thinly veiled, and Clara felt a chill despite the morning warmth. I'll pass along your message. Sullivan nodded to his driver, who helped him back into the carriage. As they turned and headed down the drive, Frank moved to stand beside Clara. Sullivan, he spat, as if the name itself left a bad taste. What did he want? To intimidate us, Clara replied, watching the carriage disappear, and to make sure we know he's aware of Colton's plan. Frank's weathered face creased with concern. Do you think he can stop the loan? I don't know, Clara admitted, but I think we should send someone to town to warn Colton. Frank nodded. I'll go myself. If Sullivan's planning anything, the boss should know about it. As Frank hurried to saddle a horse, Clara returned to Emma in the garden, her mind racing. Sullivan's visit and his knowledge of Colton's activities suggested he had sources of information within the bank or town. If he could prevent the loan from being approved, Willow Creek would be lost by noon. The morning crawled by with agonizing slowness. Clara kept the children occupied with chores and lessons, not wanting them to sense her growing anxiety as the deadline approached. By 11 o'clock, with still no sign of Colton or Frank, she found herself unable to concentrate on anything, her gaze constantly drawn to the road leading from town. Riders coming, Martha called from the porch at 11:30, and Clara rushed outside, the children at her heels. 3 horsemen approached at a gallop, Colton in the lead, with Frank and another man Clara didn't recognize close behind. They thundered into the yard, reining in their lathered horses with practiced ease. Colton's face, when he dismounted, was grim but determined. Sullivan's here, he said without preamble. At the ranch, Clara asked, alarmed. He left hours ago. No, in town, Colton clarified. He's at the bank now trying to block my loan, but he's too late. He patted his saddlebag. I got the money. The bank approved the loan based on the contracts. Relief flooded through Clara. Then the ranch is safe. Not quite yet, Colton said, glancing at the stranger who had accompanied them. This is Marshal Thornton. He's here to witness the payment and make sure Sullivan doesn't try any last-minute tricks. The marshal, a solid man with a graying mustache and the steady gaze of a lawman who had seen it all, tipped his hat to Clara. Ma'am. Sullivan's given us until noon, Colton continued, checking his pocket watch. We have 20 minutes. He's expecting us to bring the money to the bank in town, but I'm not walking into whatever trap he might have set. The payment can be made anywhere before the deadline. You think he'll come here? Clara asked, instinctively moving closer to her children. Colton nodded. I'm counting on it. If he wants this ranch as badly as I think he does, he'll come to collect in person when I don't show at the bank. As if summoned by Colton's words, the sound of approaching hoofbeats once again drew their attention to the road. This time it was Sullivan alone on horseback, riding with the easy confidence of a man who believed victory was at hand. Get the children inside, Colton said quietly to Clara. This could get ugly. Clara ushered Emma and Thomas onto the porch, where Martha waited to take them into the house. But Clara herself remained outside, standing slightly behind Colton as Sullivan reined in his horse and dismounted. Jameson, Sullivan greeted him, his voice pleasant but his eyes cold. I expected to see you at the bank. I thought you might prefer a more private setting for our transaction, Colton replied evenly. Less embarrassing for you when your plan fails. Sullivan's smile didn't waver. Plan, I'm simply a businessman collecting on a debt. The bank called in your loan, you failed to pay, and I purchased the note. It's all quite legal and above board. Is ambush and attempted murder also part of your usual business practice? Colton asked, his voice hardening. Or hiring road agents to rob stages? Sullivan's expression didn't change, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. Serious accusations, Jameson, particularly without evidence. His gaze shifted to Clara. I see your nurse is still playing housekeeper. How domestic. Clara felt Colton tense beside her at the insult, but his voice remained steady. Marshal Thornton is here to witness the payment of my loan in full, Sullivan. I have the money right here. He patted his saddlebag. For the first time, Sullivan seemed taken aback, noticing the marshal who stood quietly to one side. That's impossible, the bank assured me. That I couldn't secure another loan, Colton finished for him. You're not the only one with friends in Helena, Sullivan. The first bank was quite interested in my cattle contracts. Sullivan's composure slipped further. What contracts? They were stolen. Were they? Colton asked mildly. How interesting that you would know that detail, since I never reported the theft to the authorities. He withdrew an envelope from his saddlebag and handed it to the marshal. $5,000, payment in full for the note held by Mr. Sullivan. The marshal counted the money carefully, then nodded. All correct. Sullivan's face had grown increasingly pale as he realized his scheme had failed. This isn't over, Jameson, he said, his voice tight with suppressed rage. A smart man would still sell. The territory's changing. Small independent ranchers like you are a dying breed. Maybe so, Colton acknowledged. But Willow Creek stays in Jameson hands for now. He stepped forward, lowering his voice so that only Sullivan could hear his next words. And if anything at all, happens to threaten my ranch or the people I care about in the future, I'll know exactly where to look. Are we clear? Sullivan held his gaze for a long moment, then turned without another word, mounted his horse, and rode away, defeat evident in every line of his rigid back. As the dust from Sullivan's departure settled, Clara felt the tension drain from her body. Colton turned to her, a smile spreading slowly across his face. We did it, he said simply. Clara felt tears of relief spring to her eyes. You did it, she corrected. You saved your ranch. Colton shook his head, reaching for her hands. We did it together, he insisted. I couldn't have done it without you, Clara. The marshal cleared his throat discreetly. I'll be heading back to town now, Jameson. That payment's recorded and legal. Sullivan can't touch your property. Thank you, Marshal, Colton said, reluctantly releasing Clara's hands to shake the lawman's. I owe you for coming out here. Just doing my job, Thornton replied with a slight smile. Besides, Sullivan's made more than a few enemies in the territory. It's good to see someone stand up to him and win. As the marshal mounted his horse and rode out, the children burst from the house, unable to contain their excitement any longer. Did the bad man go away? Emma asked, skipping to Clara's side. Is the ranch safe now? Yes, sweetheart, Clara assured her, smoothing her daughter's hair. The ranch is safe. Then we can stay, Thomas asked, his solemn eyes fixed on Colton. We don't have to leave. Clara felt her heart constrict at the question, so innocent yet so revealing of her children's insecurities. Before she could form a response, Colton knelt to Thomas's level, his expression serious. This is your home for as long as you want it to be, he told the boy, then looked up to include Clara and Emma in his words. All of you. The depth of feeling in his voice left no doubt about his sincerity, and Clara felt something shift between them, a possibility opening up that she had scarcely dared to acknowledge. That evening, after the children were asleep and the ranch had settled into nighttime quiet, Clara found Colton on the porch, gazing out at the star-filled sky. She joined him at the railing, comfortable in the silence that stretched between them. I never gave you your gift from Helena, she said finally, holding out the wrapped package she had brought with her. Colton took it with a smile. You didn't need to get me anything. Open it, Clara encouraged, suddenly nervous about her choice. He unwrapped the book carefully, his expression softening as he read the title. Modern Cattle Ranching, he murmured, running his fingers over the embossed leather cover. This is perfect, Clara. Thank you. I thought it might help with your plans for expanding the herd, she explained. Colton set the book aside and turned to face her fully. Clara, I need to ask you something. Her heart quickened at his serious tone. Yes. When Thomas asked if you had to leave, I realized we've never discussed what happens next. The danger from Sullivan is past, the ranch is secure. You and the children could return to your homestead if you wanted to. Clara studied his face in the moonlight, trying to read what lay behind his carefully neutral expression. Is that what you want, she asked quietly, for us to leave? No, Colton answered immediately, his voice rough with emotion. God, no, I want you to stay, all of you. He took a deep breath. The truth is, Clara, I can't imagine Willow Creek without you anymore. These past weeks have changed everything I thought I knew about myself, about what I wanted from life. Clara felt hope rising in her chest. What do you want, Colton? You, he said simply, you and the children, a family, a home that's more than just a successful ranch. He reached for her hands, holding them gently in his. I know it hasn't been long, and if you need time to consider. Clara silenced him by pressing her fingers to his lips. I don't need time, she whispered. I know what I want too. Colton's eyes darkened as he took her meaning, and he slowly drew her closer. And what is that, Clara Garner? He asked, his voice low. A new beginning, she answered, with you. His smile was brilliant in the moonlight. Is that a yes? To a question you haven't actually asked yet, Clara pointed out, her own smile mirroring his. Colton laughed softly, then sobered, his expression becoming tender as he framed her face with his hands. Clara Garner, will you marry me? Will you make Willow Creek your home and me the happiest man in the Montana Territory? Clara's heart felt full to bursting. Yes, she said simply. Yes to all of it. His kiss was gentle at first, a question and a promise combined, then deepened as she responded. Clara had never expected to find love again after Michael's death, had convinced herself that survival alone was enough. But in Colton's arms, she rediscovered joy and possibility, the sense that life still held wonders worth embracing. When they finally drew apart, Colton rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm on her face. I love you, Clara. I think I have since that first day when you refused to let me die on your doorstep. Clara laughed softly, and I love you, stubborn cowboy that you are. Their second kiss held all the promise of the future they would build together, a future that neither of them had imagined when fate brought them together on a dusty Montana homestead. 6 months later, Clara stood before the mirror in what was now her bedroom at Willow Creek Ranch, smoothing the silk of her wedding dress. Martha had insisted on ordering it from Denver, overriding Clara's protests that something simpler would suffice. A bride should look like a bride, the older woman had declared, and seeing her reflection now, Clara had to admit Martha was right. The ivory silk complemented her fair complexion, while the delicate lace at the collar and sleeves added an elegance she hadn't worn since her days in Philadelphia. Emma danced around the room in her own new dress of pale blue, a miniature version of Clara's in style. You look like a princess, Mama, she declared, pausing in her twirling to stare admiringly. Thank you, sweetheart, Clara replied, reaching out to tuck a stray curl back into Emma's ribbon-adorned braid. You look quite princess-like yourself. A knock at the door announced Martha's arrival. It's time, she said, her eyes suspiciously bright as she took in the sight of Clara in her bridal finery. Everyone's waiting in the parlor. Clara took a deep breath, steadying her nerves. The ceremony would be small, with only the ranch hands, a few neighboring families, and the minister from town in attendance. Colton had offered to arrange a larger celebration in Helena, but Clara had preferred the intimacy of a home wedding, surrounded only by those who had become their extended family. Ready? Martha asked, adjusting the small wreath of autumn flowers in Clara's hair one last time. Ready, Clara confirmed, taking Emma's hand. Let's not keep your new papa waiting. Emma beamed at the words and practically pulled Clara down the hallway toward the stairs. At the top, they met Thomas, solemn in his new suit, his expression a mixture of excitement and anxiety as he clutched the small pillow bearing the rings. You look very handsome, Clara told him, bending to straighten his collar. Colton showed me what to do, Thomas said seriously. I walk slow and don't drop the rings. You'll be perfect, Clara assured him, feeling a rush of love for this quiet boy who had blossomed under Colton's patient attention. The parlor had been transformed for the occasion, with autumn flowers and greenery adorning the fireplace mantel and windows. The ranch hands stood awkwardly in their Sunday best, hair slicked down with water, faces freshly shaved. But Clara's eyes went immediately to Colton, waiting for her beside the minister. He wore a new black suit that emphasized his broad shoulders, his hair neatly combed, his face clean-shaven for the occasion. But it was his expression that caught and held her, the wonder in his eyes as he watched her descend the stairs, the love that radiated from him, visible to everyone present. Emma went first, sprinkling flower petals from a small basket with dramatic flair. Thomas followed more solemnly, clutching the ring pillow with intense concentration. And then it was Clara's turn, walking alone toward the man who had changed her life in ways she could never have imagined. That day he fell wounded from his horse. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of emotion. Clara was conscious of the children standing beside them, of Colton's hands warm and steady as they held hers, of the deep sincerity in his voice as he repeated his vows. And then the minister was pronouncing them husband and wife, and Colton was kissing her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. Mrs. Jameson, he whispered against her lips as they parted, and Clara felt the rightness of it in her very soul. The celebration afterward was joyful but simple, a feast prepared by Martha, music provided by one of the hands who played a surprisingly sweet fiddle, and dancing that continued well into the evening. Through it all, Clara found her gaze constantly returning to Colton, still amazed that this man, this strong, honorable, loving man, was now her husband. As the festivities wound down and the guests departed, Colton drew Clara aside, a mysterious smile playing about his lips. I have something to show you, he said, leading her toward the study. Inside on his desk lay a legal document with the territorial seal. What is this? Clara asked, picking it up. The deed to your homestead, Colton explained. I had my lawyer track down the bank that held your mortgage. It's paid in full now, and the land is legally yours. Clara stared at him in surprise. But why? We live here now. Colton's expression grew more serious. Because it was your home with Michael, the place where your children were born. I didn't want you to lose it, even if we never lived there. He took her hands in his, and because someday it will be Thomas's or Emma's if they choose to claim it. Their inheritance from their father. Tears welled in Clara's eyes at this unexpected gesture of understanding and respect for her past. Thank you, she whispered, unable to find words adequate to express what his thoughtfulness meant to her. Colton drew her into his arms. I want you to know that I'll never try to replace Michael in your heart or in the children's memories, he said softly. He'll always be a part of who you are, who they are. And that's one of the many reasons I love you, Clara replied, resting her head against his chest. Your capacity for understanding, for seeing beyond yourself. He kissed the top of her head. I have one more surprise, he admitted, but this one's for tomorrow. Clara looked up at him curiously. What is it? If I told you it wouldn't be a surprise, Colton teased, kissing the tip of her nose, but I promise it's worth the wait. The surprise was revealed the next morning when Colton led Clara, Emma, and Thomas to the stables after breakfast. Inside, they found Frank holding the reins of a beautiful bay mare, already saddled and waiting. She's yours, Colton told Clara. Every rancher's wife needs her own horse. Emma squealed with delight while Thomas approached the mare cautiously, his eyes wide with admiration. Clara herself was momentarily speechless, reaching out to stroke the animal's velvet nose. She's gentle but spirited, Colton explained, perfect for someone who's ridden before but might be a bit rusty. She's beautiful, Clara managed, touched once again by his thoughtfulness. Thank you. What's her name? Emma asked, bouncing with excitement. That's for your mother to decide, Colton replied, smiling at Clara. Clara considered the mare, noting the intelligent gleam in her dark eyes, the proud set of her head. Hope, she decided. Her name is Hope. Colton's smile deepened with understanding. A perfect choice. They spent the morning riding together across Willow Creek's vast acreage, Colton leading them to places Clara had not yet seen. A hidden valley where wildflowers bloomed even in autumn, a ridge that offered views all the way to the distant mountains, a secluded pond where deer came to drink at dusk. "This is all ours," Emma asked in wonder as they paused on a hilltop overlooking the ranch buildings below. "All ours," Colton confirmed, reaching across to take Clara's hand. "Our legacy to you and Thomas someday." Clara looked at her new husband, at her children's bright faces, at the beautiful land spread before them, and felt a profound sense of gratitude. 8 months ago, she had been a desperate widow facing starvation and failure. Now she was the wife of a man she loved deeply, secure in a home where her children could thrive. "What are you thinking?" Colton asked, noticing her contemplative expression. Clara smiled, squeezing his hand. "That life can change in an instant, sometimes for the worst, but sometimes," she looked into his blue eyes, filled with love for her, "sometimes for the very best." Colton leaned across the space between their horses to kiss her softly. "The very best," he agreed, "and this is just the beginning." As they rode back toward the ranch, the autumn sun warm on their faces, Clara knew he was right. This was their beginning, not just hers and Colton's, but all four of them together, a family forged through loss and courage, through helping hands extended in times of need, through love that had bloomed unexpectedly on the Montana frontier. Behind them, Willow Creek Ranch spread like a promise kept, a dream fulfilled. And ahead lay all the days of their lives together, waiting to be written with the same courage and love that had brought them to this moment. What had begun with a wounded stranger falling from his horse at a desperate widow's doorstep had become the greatest blessing of their lives, a testament to the truth that even in the harshest places, hope and love could not only survive but flourish. For Clara and Colton Jameson, the wide Montana sky was not a symbol of isolation and hardship, but of limitless possibility. And in each other's arms, they had found what both had once believed impossible. A love strong enough to heal past wounds, brave enough to face an uncertain future, and deep enough to last a lifetime.